Okay, well, we've still got a few people joining us, but I think we'll get started because I'm sure we have a lot to cover today. So good morning to everyone who is online. Welcome to this month's CEBRA webinar, often known as CEBRAnars. My name is Julia Wells. I'm the Assistant Secretary of the Biosecurity Sustainable Funding branch, which is part of our Biosecurity Strategy Reform Division here at Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry. I also look after our research and innovation governance, including our relationship with CEBRA. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people as the traditional custodians of the land on many of us are meeting today, but also recognise other people or families with connection to the lands of the ACT or region. I wish to acknowledge and respect their continuing culture and the contribution they make to life in this city and in the region. I extend that recognition to the traditional custodians on the lands which staff and other participants are meeting today as well, and to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people attending today's webinar. We've got people from all over, I'm sure, today, so welcome from all parts of Australia. Just from a practical, I think we've got everybody, looks like they've got their microphone off. If we can just make sure that that's helps with the voice. We've got the session being recorded so people can see it, and there'll be an opportunity to ask questions after the presentation. Feel free to put your hand up or to pop any questions into the chat as well as we go. For those of you who haven't joined us before here, the Centre for Excellence of Biosecurity Risk Analysis, CEBRA, is a long-standing biosecurity research initiative hosted by the University of Melbourne. We've now got a new 4-year agreement underway that we've just started in the last couple of months, which is very exciting. So CEBRA will continue to provide the Australian and New Zealand governments with expert biosecurity risk analysis and advice that helps inform a range of biosecurity risk management activities. Today, we're going to hear from Associate Professor Susie Hester, Dr. Lucie Newsome and Dr. Gary He as they delve into the mixed method research undertaken to explore the value of investment in international standard setting. Can I just comment that I think this work is so critical. Influencing international standards is not only really important to make sure that we're promoting science-based biosecurity risk management, which is really important to us, but it's also really important for trade and market access, which is important to all of us and to the Australian economy as a whole. Susie is the Deputy CEO and Chief Investigator at CEBRA. She's an applied economist working in areas such as highlighting the importance of human behaviour in policy design, valuing the role of passive surveillance, and supporting biosecurity stakeholders with tools to determine the impact of their projects. Lucie is a senior lecturer and researcher at the University of New England, lecturing in economics and management. Her research activities focus on the influence of gender in politics, policy and business, particularly agribusiness. And Gary is a senior veterinary officer here at DAF, serves as Australia's focal point for animal disease notification to the World Organisation for Animal Health, and plays a key role in continued engagement, contributing to strategic direction, international standard setting and disease reporting. Please join me in welcoming Susie, Lucie and Gary. Wonderful to have you all. I'll hand over now to you, Susie. Thank you.
Great. We don't have our notes screen. What have I done? Sorry, everyone. That was a stop sharing. And let me just go like that. And then I will share that screen. And that should work. Okay. Sorry about that. Thank you, Julia, and hello from Animal Country. Lucie and I are at the University of New England in Armidale for this presentation. Thank you all for joining us. We are to talk about work that was undertaken in CEBRA 23B. The project has just finished, and it was initiated in the CVO's office by Rob Atkinson in late 2022. Rob is now our Ag Counsellor in Bangkok. There's a small chance Rob is online, so if you're there, Rob, hello. And Rob wanted this project to happen because he wanted to shine a light on what is really involved in the work on international standard setting and how Australia plays its part. And a lot of DAF staff are involved in the plant division and in the animal division, and the work they do might not be obvious, it might not be well understood, but it's certainly critical to it's critical to keeping our export industries as profitable as we can. So the project is using the mad cow disease standard revisions that occurred between 2019 and 2023. It's a really useful case study because a lot of effort was undertaken to ensure that the right science was introduced to the standard setting process. But during the standard revision, there was a chance that things were not going to go so well for Australia, and we'll unpack all of that work and hopefully show the value of the work that continues to be undertaken in this area in the department. I'm sure that Gary and Lucie can help assist with this presentation today. This slide shows the outline. I'm going to start by giving you some context to the project. We'll talk a little bit about BSE. We'll talk about the Australian beef rendering and feed sectors. Gary is going to talk about the standard revision process in WOAH, the World Organization for Animal Health, including what could have gone wrong. Lucie's going to take us through a qualitative analysis, and this was a really interesting and really useful part of the project. I'm going to spend a very short amount of time on the quantitative analysis. We did a really simple financial analysis of the costs and benefits, and then we'll end with some key findings and recommendations. Okay, so the research question for 23B was simply, what is the value of engagement in international standard setting? And again, we used the bovine spongiform encephalopathy standard revision. We're going to refer to that disease as BSC. And in the international standard space, WOAH, the World Organization for Animal Health, is the agency with oversight and processes around standard revision. Again, the methodology we used was a mixed methods approach. We complemented a financial analysis with a qualitative analysis using interviews of a handful of key stakeholders in that process, in the standard negotiation revision process. So what is BSC? People in this seminar would know it as mad cow disease. Now, look, I'm not a vet, but I'm keeping this high level, and Gary will follow on and can correct any errors in how I talk about this disease. So BSE is a transmissible spongiform encephalopathy that a TST that's caused by misfolded proteins called prions, and in cattle it is a progressively fatal nervous system disease caused by these misfolded prions building up in nervous tissues. It's related to scrapie in sheep and goats and chronic wasting disease in deer. There are two types, and this is important for, I guess, unpacking the issues with the standard revision. The type that we're most worried about is classical BSE, the first type listed in the slide. And this is spread by ingesting prion-contaminated feed. The other type, and so that is, I guess, ruminants ingesting feedstuff from ruminants that has BSE in it. The other type is atypical BSE. Now, this is rare and it occurs naturally and sporadically in older cattle, but it is crucially, it's not considered to be transmissible under field conditions, and it can only be detected by really intensive surveillance. Despite the rarity of atypical BSE, it was a central point of contention in the WOAH standard revision process for BSE. So BSE was first diagnosed in the United Kingdom in 1986, and that figure shows the monthly caseload in the UK from first detection up until 2000. By 2023, more than 181,000 cases had been detected in the UK. So that was the focal point, although spread of BSE occurred, and it was reported in more than 25 countries, but mainly in Europe, including Asia, the Middle East, and North America. The real issue, I guess, with BSE, or compounding the issue, is the zoonotic potential of BSE. It was linked to a horrible wasting disease in humans, Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. And so the connection between BSE and CJD triggered a global public health crisis in the 1990s. The World Organization for Animal Health, of course, introduced really strict measures to control BSE spread within countries and across countries. And there are a whole range of measures related to imports, production, processing. So, for example, the end use of infected cattle was restricted. There was a ban on the consumption of ruminant-derived material by ruminants. And the raft of changes that countries had to make to their production and processing system were substantial and expensive, but those changes were necessary and they happened. In terms of international trade, the WOAH has recognises two categories, and that's negligible risk status and controlled risk status. Negligible risk status is the most favourable status possible, and indeed Australia, with no detected cases of BSE, continued to trade with that status, along with a few other countries. Now, while WOAH recognises those two trading statuses, it is really down to trading partner requirements. Trading partners determine the basis of trade between countries, and in many cases, trading partners' requirements can be more stringent than WOAH. So let's turn our attention now to the Australian context and the industries that were potentially going to be affected by these measures. The Australian beef rendering and feed sectors are massive for Australia. I've got a few stats on this next slide about those sectors. In 2023, so I guess at the end of the standard revision process, we had 28 million head. Most of those are in Queensland. And in 23-24, we processed 7.7 million head. And most of that product was exported. 70% of beef was exported, and to very lucrative markets in China, the USA, Japan, and Korea. At the time, the export value was 11 billion, but if we fast forward to now, the value of that export market is getting close to $16 billion. Live cattle exports are also important for Australia, and in 22-23 we exported 485,000 head, worth almost 800 million, nearly $1 billion now, and our key markets for those live cattle were Indonesia and Vietnam. The rendering and stock feed sectors are also important in this discussion. Rendering turns beef byproducts into animal protein meal, processed protein, and tallow. And they're also referred to as RAM, ruminant excess material. I knew that, sorry. RAM, let's just call it RAM. Important points to note is that rendering occurs in Australia largely by low temperature processes, but for countries that were affected by BSE, WOAH regulations meant they had to use high temperature processes. Australia has around 70 rendering facilities. Half of the meal produced is exported and half is used in stock feed production. In terms of stock feed manufacture, we have around 195 feed mills, and most mills operate mixed lines for ruminant and non-ruminant derived material. And here it's also important to note that BSE affected countries had to use separate lines. So when I say we used mixed lines, we do flushing and cleaning in between using RAM and non-RAM material. So Australia had a lot to lose in these standard revision processes, in the standard revision process. Now I'm going to turn over to Gary to talk about that process in WOAH and what eventuated. Thanks, Gary.
Great, thanks for that, Susie. So I'm going to cover the journey of a WOAH international standard quite generally, but then hone in more specifically on our work with WOAH's BSE standards and also the status assessment. I guess the first thing to point out is that these standards do take time to develop, usually 2 to 4 years, sometimes in the case for BSE, a bit longer. Susie already mentioned WOAH's BSE standards sit in a larger collection of standards called the Terrestrial Animal Health Code. WOAH's Terrestrial Code Commission is responsible for developing and revising this collection of standards. So where this all starts is that a case to develop new standards or update some of the existing ones might be identified by this commission, or perhaps it might be raised to this commission by WOAH members or other international experts. The Code Commission would then develop the draft standards, and they would either do this by themselves or where there's great complexity or they need great expertise, they might access scientific advice through dedicated groups called ad hoc groups, which, as the name suggests, kind of established on an ad hoc basis for whether the need is, or they might consult with their scientific commission counterparts. So this next step is where it takes years. WOAH's draft standards are then circulated to delegates in member countries, and you can see by the diagram there, that's for us when it enters Australia. So our delegate, who's our Chief Veterinary Officer, receives these standards and they're circulated to our stakeholders. So in my substantive role in the OCVO, or Office of the Chief Veterinary Officer, we coordinate this public consultation across government, across industry, NGOs, academia, research, and beyond as well. Using the comments and input we receive from our stakeholders, we have to form a single Australian position, and often, for contentious chapters or standards that can be quite challenging. We form a single Australian position and provide this back to the Code Commission. The Code Commission considers our standards the Code Commission considers our comments and along with comments from other WOAH members, and then they apply these or make changes to the draft standards before they're circulated again during the next consultation period. And consultation periods occur twice a year. So the Commission meets in February and September each year, and usually the report and the draft standards are circulated the month afterwards, or month and a bit afterwards. So this process occurs over and over again. Eventually, the Code Commission decides that a standard is mature enough, and when that happens, they'll propose it to the WOAH General Session for adoption. I think of the WOAH General Session as well as big annual meeting, and there's equivalent meetings for other big organizations you might hear about, such as the UN General Assembly or the FAO. I think it's called the General Assembly as well. So it's here at the General Session that delegates vote on the adoption of these standards. So each delegate represents their country. They can put forward a single vote, and a 2/3 majority is needed for any new standards to be adopted. So based on the system, you could probably appreciate that it's developed with the intention for it to be science-based, and that scientific evidence provided by members, and then also based on consensus as well. We'll get the next slide, please. So let's talk about our work with BSE standards. And to do that, we just need to go back a bit. In response to the global outbreak of BSE, WOAH standards on BSE were first published in 1992. And Susie mentioned they provide pretty stringent measures to help countries prevent the entry of BSE through imports. But there's also fairly intensive measures around animal surveillance of BSE, and also various measures to stop BSE risk materials from entering the human or animal feed chains, and it being transmitted to other animals. So updates to this standard or this chapter has occurred over the years, but there hasn't been a comprehensive review up to that point. So that point being 2018. Over the same time, the global incidence of BSE had greatly decreased thanks to all the measures that we have mentioned. And year on year, we're seeing nearly 0 cases. So we'll get the next slide, please. In 2018, WOAH, recognizing the changing instance rate globally around BSE and also the changes in the science around BSE, they decided to undertake a comprehensive review of the BSE standards. This is complex. The standards are very long, and the science is obviously complex. So they established 2 ad hoc groups. One to review how BSE risk status is determined in the standards. The second one to review the BSE surveillance requirements. And these groups met 4 times in total, and provided advice to WOAH, which led to the first draft of the new BSE standards. And this first draft was released in 2019. I mentioned there are 2 ad hoc groups. Today we'll mostly focus on the ad hoc group or some of the considerations around how BSE risk status is determined in the standards. So, as mentioned, members can have either negligible or controlled risk. In the old standards or the regional standards, a country's risk status could be determined based on an entry assessment or an exposure assessment. And my oversimplification of both of these assessments is that an entry assessment considers the likelihood of BSE entering the country from overseas. An exposure assessment considers the likelihood of cattle being exposed to BSE agents, either through BSE entering or through existing cases within their domestic herd. So originally, countries could be considered negligible risk based on, well, if they fulfill one of the 2 assessments for classical BSE. However, in its review, the ad hoc group advised WOAH that countries should have to fulfill both assessments, and while there was no evidence that atypical BSE was transmissible, the ad hoc group decided that it should still be included in the exposure assessment as a precautionary measure. And this would be a major point of contention for Australia. So we'll fast forward to 2021, WOAH sends, sorry. Same slide. Yeah. Thank you. So we'll fast forward to 2021, WOAH sends Australia, New Zealand, and some of the other countries an information request on our animal health systems. So this request was to help WOAH understand the implications of the draft BSE standards should they be adopted, especially for the exposure assessment. So in 2022, we're contacted again for some follow-up information. Both of these information requests were for a lot of information and data that Australia typically wouldn't be needed to provide to WOAH to substantiate our status, and we do this every year. So responding to them took a lot of hours and took a lot of consultation across government and industry, and we had to access some data that was quite difficult to get a hold of. The larger issue here was, the second point of contention was around the timeline. So by 2022, WOAH was ready to put the BSE standards up for adoption, but member countries were still being asked to vote on these standards without receiving the outcomes from their information request. So essentially, we'd be voting to adopt the standards without knowing what the impacts of that standard would be on our status and our trade and everything around that. So how did Australia respond? In addition to our standard input into the consultation process, which I mentioned was twice yearly, we had to step up our representation on both WOAH's scientific basis for atypical BSE and also that kind of process that I mentioned. Again, Lucie will cover this in more detail, but we sought joint positions with other countries over concerns on both of these issues. So we leveraged existing WOAH regional forums, and we even wrote to WOAH directly. And quite importantly, in the margins of the WOAH general session, ahead of the voting session, we were able to raise our concerns with senior members of WOAH in person in Paris. Ultimately, WOAH decided to postpone the adoption of these BSE standards, at least until there was greater consensus amongst members. So in the late 2022, we received the outcomes from the 2 information requests, and it was that we would continue to maintain our negligible risk status for BSE. And under the draft standards that were also circulated at that time, atypical BSE was no longer applicable when determining status, and no longer applicable to the exposure assessment. So finally, in May of 2023, the new version of the BSE standards went back to a vote, and this time it was adopted with the support of Australia. So really excellent outcome. Let's go to the next slide. That'll be the final slide for me. So obviously that was the best outcome for Australia. To be able to maintain our negligible risk status without any conditions on us means that we're able to continue to have ongoing trade and market access overseas, especially to particularly lucrative markets. Our animal production systems reflect the fact that we've never had BSE in any form, and that we have very strict measures against importing it. But should atypical BSE have remained on that assessment procedure, so the procedure for exposure assessment, it's quite possible that our systems would have been inadequate to meet the WOAH's requirements. And then in that case, it's possible that our status, again, under this hypothetical version of the standards that would be adopted, our status could be downgraded, perhaps to controlled risk. So that would have been catastrophic, but quite unlikely, to be fair. Based on what WOAH was asking us in the information request, what's probably more likely would have been that we'd have to change our production systems and practices in order to meet WOAH's standards and in order to maintain negligible risk status. So number 2, 3, and 4 are listed there, and these are some of the changes that we might have seen. So it could have involved the removal of risk material from animal export chains. So these are tissues that would have had the greatest concentration of BSE agents such as brains, eyes, spinal cords, and some other organs. High pressure processing for Australian rendered meals. So new processes and infrastructure would be needed in order to undertake this high pressure processing. In addition to extra input costs, probably more importantly, it could introduce some new or greater OHS risks as well. And finally, dedicated lines for animal feed that contain ruminant material. I think Susie's already mentioned this. Our mills manufacture stock feeds. Well, a lot of them do on the same lines, just with flushing and cleaning in between. So this change would mean that they would have to kind of dedicate additional costs to dedicate to separate lines. Now, yeah, I'm not an expert in these in industry practice by any means, so I won't go deep into them, but the consequences would have been greater input and greater infrastructure costs. So that would make our international exports less competitive. Now, hopefully that paints a good picture of the events. We'll take a step back now. I'll hand it to Lucie, and she'll cover her analysis on some of these events that I just discussed. Thank you.
Thanks, Gary. So what we're going to do now is delve a little bit deeper through a qualitative analysis of 7 interviews with key stakeholders. So just to recap the important things to keep in mind as we go into this next stage that have been raised by Susie and by Gary. Firstly, the world gets pretty jumpy about BSE, or mad cow's disease, due to the crisis of the 1990s. Secondly, the stakes are really high for Australian industry, for beef and rendering in particular. Thirdly, that the negligible risk status that we had gave us a lot of privilege to access to premium markets. Fourth, that the process of developing standards takes a long time, and it's quite rigorous and consultative in WOAH, but to have good representation of Australia's interests, you need good science. That requires industry collaboration, because really for atypical BSE, which is the issue here, there wasn't a lot that was known. So for the CBO and the OCBO, it took a sustained effort of collaboration with industry to get the required data and to be in a good place to represent Australia's interests at WOAH. So I came into this project as a qualitative researcher with a background in political science, and really enjoyed delving into the nitty-gritty of how representation can be successful, particularly with international standard settings bodies. So we interviewed 7 representatives or stakeholders to the issues, so 3 from industry, 3 from DAF, and 1 from the Australian Centre for Disease Preparedness, who also sits on the Scientific Commission for Animal Disease within WOAH, to understand what really went on in terms of representing Australia's interests, but also averting what Gary's just outlined could be some quite horrendous and catastrophic outcomes at one end and of the spectrum, and then with the other possible outcomes could definitely still be a regulatory burden on industry. So a pretty successful outcome, and let's have a look at how it was achieved. So as I mentioned, I'm a political science researcher, so please indulge me for a moment while I give you a little bit of theory, just to understand how these standard setting bodies like WOAH get authority that nations like Australia will buy into. So there's nothing to say that WOAH has to have the legitimacy that it has, but the reason it has legitimacy is because it seemed to have almost a monopoly on expert knowledge within these very specific fields, in this case atypical BSE. They get legitimacy because they're seen as following procedural norms, so they consult broadly, they ask for, there's multiple opportunities for inputs, there's multiple committees, and it's quite democratic in terms of the way decision-making exists. So that's how they get their authority. And it's important to keep in mind that this is what was at risk for them if Australia and other stakeholders rejected their decision making around atypical BSE and negligible risk status. So the issues that emerged from the qualitative analysis, so the interviews, were that it becomes onto the agenda of WOAH member states because atypical BSE becomes an issue of concern, and this is leveraged by those countries that don't have negligible BSE status, so therefore don't have A, the premium access to markets, and B, have more stringent production and surveillance requirements than the member countries with negligible status. So this is mostly, if you think about Europe, and countries that have had BSE in the past, they didn't have this, the status that benefited them both economically and in terms of industry efficiency that countries such as Australia, but as we can see from the map, many others enjoyed. So atypical BSE is leveraged as a way to even the playing ground for those particular European nations that had controlled status for BSE. And they leverage this to make the argument that the requirements with the control of BSE should be evened out amongst nations. So basically, Australia and other countries should be subject to the same conditions that those with controlled BSE status had. So that's how the issue gets on the agenda, and it's quite a pressure cooker environment. There's a requirement to respond really quickly. There's little known about atypical BSE, so mobilising in the Australian case between the Quads Alliance to get data is really crucial, and to get data quite quickly. So the Quads Alliance is a group of countries comprising of Australia, Canada, New Zealand and the US, and they're a counter bloc, voting bloc to the EU. So these countries are in a similar position when it comes to BSE and have similar things at stake. So Australia and the CBO utilise the Quads Alliance to get scientific information. And as one industry representative said in this quote, which I'll paraphrase, as the saying, you have to respond quickly, but also you have to have this foresight of 2 to 3 years of what standard setting is going to look like. You have to preempt what those changes might mean for industry and gather data, build alliances, and have really strong networks with industry so you can respond quickly. So the industry representative says you have to have foresight for the significant implications that could happen 3 years down the track. And that's very difficult. In terms of swaying the argument, the OCBO argued that existing feed bans had been really effective in eradicating classical BSE across the globe, and that atypical BSE was not going to be a progression of classical BSE. It was more likely to be a random event. And this is where the use of scientific data and the collaborations with the Quads and also with industry comes into play. Australia also benefited from their arguments around the science of atypical BSE aligning to that of the Scientific Commission for Animal Disease, so SCAD within WOAH. So within that consultative group, the argument was made that atypical BSE didn't need to be a listed disease. It could be instead just notified if it came up. And that decision-making based on the science presented and collected through the Quads, through industry, and supported by the scientific committee within WOAH really helped to change the conversation on how atypical BSE should be treated. The other factors include that our former CBO had leadership positions within WOAH and was seen to follow the rules. So remembering that the legitimacy of WOAH comes from following procedural-based rules, being transparent, being accountable, and being consensus-oriented. So Australia was seen as a good citizen of WOAH in that it supported those key tenets of what made WOAH legitimate. So the leadership positions of the CBO, that the CBO had strong credibility, and thirdly, that Australia had been a good citizen in providing and sharing data, making lots of comments on drafts, being very, very active as a member, stood Australia in in a good place to be able to influence the WOAH's decision making. So as Gary said, really favourable outcome at the end of the day. It was, I hope you've kind of gleaned how much work it was, how high pressure it was, what was at risk from what we've said so far, but it led to Australia, the decision-making coming in Australia's favour. So in terms of the reasons that led up to that, we've covered that Australia had a really strong reputation for bringing reliable data. So when it was trying to use scientific information to shape the debate, it came from a reputation of coming from a solid scientific basis, which gave a degree of legitimacy to Australia's positions. We've covered that it talks about that Australia had really strong relationships with industry and with the Quads, so the other three English-speaking nations. But the things that we also need to flag, which we haven't so far, is that WOAH was very worried that it was going to get a powerful, or maybe powerful is not the right word, but a good citizen in terms of Australia and the other nations offside if it ignored the science that was being brought to them and made a decision that was going to have adverse impacts. So there may not be consensus, which is part of what makes WOAH legitimate, that there's going to be a significant amount of countries offside, and in doing so, that these countries may not buy into WOAH's legitimacy going forward as an international standard setting body. So now I'll hand it back to Susie to bring it home.
Thanks, Lucie. So yes, here we are. We have a really good outcome from as a result of all the hard work of people in the OCVO. But it wasn't going to necessarily be like that. And Gary presented the 4 outcomes that we thought were possible under the process of standard revision. And so the brief for this project was to do a very simple financial analysis. I mean, it's probably, I guess, quite obvious that if Australia loses its negligible risk status and loses access to our lucrative markets, that it's almost catastrophic for the beef industry. Competing countries can come into those markets and we would be unsure how long it would take to get back in. Similarly, with the avoided outcomes 2, 3 and 4, there were some very expensive changes to manufacturing and production processes that would be needed to occur. So we only undertook a very simple financial analysis. We developed these counterfactual scenarios and I would like to acknowledge that this process involves a lot of uncertainty. So we have some known facts, and those known facts are the actual proposed changes that resulted from the process. We have Australia's engagement. It's also documented, and we know that. And we know that there's a successful outcome for Australia. But while there are a lot of unknowns, and I just want to declare those, the precise pathways and specific impacts, we had to assume those based on what we knew about standard changes, noting that we didn't have an outbreak of BSE causing these changes to trade and changes to production. So potentially the pathway to losing markets could have been different, but we had to make many bold assumptions. We used some historical trade data, and we consulted heavily with industry to come up with our numbers. Traditionally, when an economist would do this sort of work, you would do a more complicated partial equilibrium trade modelling analysis, similar to the work that ABARES did for the foot and mouth disease outbreak. But that wasn't what was required here. We were comparing the costs of engagement by the Australian government with the avoided damages, the benefits from the engagement. And if we start on the right-hand side, with the costs of engagement, we also had to make some bold assumptions there. And I guess we were assuming that all the staff time was taken up on BSE, when in reality a lot of other great work is done as well. Other diseases can take time of staff in the Chief Vet's office. So in terms of cost of engagement, we took into account our annual membership fees. We also give large voluntary contributions to WOAH. And we also took into account travel costs of DAF staff to general sessions and other meetings overseas, and salary costs of staff. So that would be Gary, Rob when he was here, and the Chief Vet. The total annual costs we are assuming is 4.1 million, and those costs can be compared with the impacts that were avoided. So we estimated that if we lost our negligible risk status, and it took some time to be reinstated, that it would be a loss of about $11.3 billion. Similarly, with removing risk material from export chains, additional costs there over the 70 export-focused abbot plants would be 19 million. Changing to high-pressure processing from low-temperature processing for rendered meals would be extremely expensive, 143.5 million. And changing the way we produce stock feed, 1.5 billion. I've just put there the return on investment scenario for scenario 1, which, as you would imagine, is huge. And the way to interpret that is that in the case of BSE engagement, every dollar invested in international standard setting avoided about $2,700 in losses. And you can combine all the scenarios together, and that number is even larger. Now, I would put to you that the size of the return on investment shouldn't surprise anyone, given the size of the red meat sector and our trade in these lucrative export markets. Okay, now to close the presentation with the key findings. And look, I've summarised these. The final report should be publicly available within the next couple of weeks, and it, of course, has a lot more detail on key findings and recommendations. So we've grouped the key findings under 3 headings. The first was noting the effectiveness of Australia's engagement. We note that WOAH's democratic processes are effective. We were able to bring the science to the table, and we were listened to, and Lucie's gone through that in detail. Our engagement was effective, and the return on investment engagement is significant. And I think these findings are reasonably transferable to other contexts. There were some critical enablers of success. So in-person attendance at WOAH meetings is critical. Those meetings are held in Europe, so a significant distance away from Australia, so reasonably difficult to get to, but in-person attendance is critical. We also found that the national coordination functions of the OCVO, the CVO, are also critical. Public-private partnerships were key to this, working effectively with industry, government and industry partnerships. And the third theme under which we have findings are the influence through networks. So we determined that, yes, regional leadership is really important. Relationships with like-minded parties or members of WOAH were also important. And as I mentioned earlier, influence is likely to be effective beyond BSE. We've selected 4 summaries. We have about recommendations, sorry. We've summarised those. We have around 9. And the first is that international standard setting should be prioritised in policy and funding decisions. So its importance should be recognised and funded appropriately. We note that Gary and Rob seem overworked. and we had to bug them for our project needs. But we need to make sure the department has the staffing and resources to meet growing demands of what we haven't talked about, but what is an expanding remit of WOAH. We also recommend that Australia maximises its influence and representation through leadership and partnerships, so we continue to grow those, and that engagement is can be broadened across international standard setting organisations. Finally, to some acknowledgements, and I'll get Lucie and Gary to chime in again in a minute. Our 7 interviewees were fantastic. The semi-structured interviews were really illuminating, led beautifully by Lucie. We're very lucky to have her. We'd like to thank the Chief Vet's Office in DAF. We were so fortunate that Rob was really could be so focused on this project, and Gary came along, and Gary had first-hand experience of the standard setting process. We had really great help from industry, from the Australian Meat Industry Council and the Australian Renderers Association, the Stock Feed Manufacturers Council of Australia, and TEAS Group. And I want to also acknowledge UNE in this work. Gary and Lucie, any final comments before we shoot to questions?
Nothing from me, I don't think, Susie. I'm interested to see what's happening in the chat, though. And if anyone has any questions, let's have a look. Let's Gary.
Let's stop sharing.
Just a thank you from myself to everyone that was involved. I actually didn't, get involved in this work until 2021 as a junior officer as well. So the outcome we see today was really the result of a lot of years of work from my predecessors in OCVAL across various divisions of DAF and also outside of DAF. And certainly a special thanks to Rob for all the work that he put into both the BSE, the BSE matters and also this project. Thank you, Susie and Lucie, for your analysis and your report. Hugely complicated body of work, but I think we all worked very well, and we're very focused on getting the details right and telling an accurate recount of the events.
Yep, agree. It was great. The project worked really well. It was a pleasure to work with you, Gary.
Ash, you've got a question.
I just wanted to make a couple of comments. So for the benefit of those online, my name's Ash Jordan, and I'm the director of the multilateral engagement team. So essentially took over from Rob, who conceived the project. I think Rob is online, so thanks to Rob on that. And thanks Susie and Lucie and Gary, but also there's a lot of other expertise we draw on across the department and externally, not just from Biosecurity Animal Division, but all over. So we really appreciate the investment those experts make in putting their time towards steering the standards in the direction we want to see them go. Just in terms of the recommendations, we're kind of part way through doing a lot of that already. So thankfully, for Gary and I, we've doubled our footprint in our team. So we'll have 4 people going forward, although Gary is on secondment for a little while. So we're at 3 at the moment. We've been very successful in recent years through the efforts of Gary and Beth and others in putting Australians in pretty influential positions in WOAH, so that we can maintain our credibility and influence with the organisation, and also build out alliances through Quads Alliance and other forums. So thanks again, and if anyone else has questions, follow on from me.
Thanks, Ash. That's great that your team has increased. That's really, really good. And hello to Rob if you are out there.
Well, it doesn't look like we have questions now, but I'm sure people will feel free to reach out to any of our presenters today or the relevant people in the department on such an interesting topic. A really big thank you from me to Susie, Lucie and Gary. Just such an interesting topic in the sense of how the complexities of science come together with the complexities of industry practices. And I can only imagine how complex the negotiations are based on all of those different factors. So really interesting. And as I said before at the beginning, really important in terms of the importance of keeping our industries competitive in terms of export markets. So, and for those of us who have been around a long time, remembering back to the 1990s when people were scared of eating hamburgers because it really was, a very serious incident. So just to finish off then, I wanted to remind everyone that the recording is available on the CEBRA YouTube channel, so you can have a look there or you can share it with your friends. Our next CEBRAnar is scheduled for Thursday, the 25th of September, and we will let you know very soon what the topic will be. So other than that, just wanted to thank everybody for joining us, and I hope you all have a really great day.